Arknights Endfield has way too many fun teams and characters to play with, and with the recent better rating of Gilberta now, most players probably spend most of their pulls already, and you might want to think twice before spending the rest of them. That is exactly why I made this video, to break down the pull value of each character as detailed as possible. You may want to even consider just waiting for future characters like this beautiful lady we saw in the story. I'll be discussing each character's best team, pros and cons, and consider the future value with you guys as well, so hopefully we can get a full picture of whether or not you should be pulling for them. I think that'll be the most helpful. With that said, let's get into it. We'll start off by mentioning the current banner, Gilberta. The best Gilberta teams currently are the Yvonne / Laevatain team and the Laevatain electric team, which are all valid teams that you won't regret too much if you do pull her for them. More on the teams later though. Gilberta's role in the current moment can be categorized into two. The first is the best enemy gatherer in the game, and the second is the highest value art susceptibility applier to set up teams with explosive damage in a short time because of her short 5-second art susceptibility debuff. You probably heard of this already. However, what you may want to consider is the up and coming Umbral Monument mode, which is an endgame mode that does have situations where you'll be fighting multiple enemies. That is where Gilberta can actually be quite valuable outside of just daily explorations and farming, especially for teams that doesn't do as ideally against multiple enemies like the Laevatain or Yvonne teams. Not to mention, her role as the highest value art susceptibility applier means that she's the absolute best option in Laevatain nuke teams, since Avi's damage does happen in an instant. Gilberta simply has to buff that one short period of time and you'll obtain the best benefits with zero wastage. So far we've considered the best value of Gilberta, but if we consider her general usability, you'll find that she's simply just solid overall. You can use her in most teams, some less ideal, some just fine, which is where we'll have to mention her cons. The few problems with Gilberta you may find is her very short debuff duration on the ult of 5 seconds, which means any teams that takes more than 5 seconds to deal the most damage will lose value with Gilberta. For example, with Laevatain, her ult lasts for 15 seconds, Gilberta simply can't last that long, which is why you would prefer Ardelia's 30-second debuffs instead. The second problem with Gilberta will be her required nature infliction on her skill and ult. You see, this shouldn't be a negative thing where she's able to apply nature infliction, but it's just an unfortunate case where the game currently doesn't have enough variety of teams that utilizes more complicated reactions. For instance, Laevatain's main shtick is to apply multiple stacks of simple heat infliction, and then we've got Laevatain, which her main shtick is to apply multiple stacks of simple cryo infliction, and she'll be able to deal damage. The team logic is pretty simple that introducing Gilberta's nature infliction might actually cause more harm than good by consuming those inflictions and turning them into other arts reaction where it'll stop them from using their own kit now. The reason why Laevaitain's team though actually don't mind this is because she straight up doesn't need electric infliction at the point of her doing damage. So you can trigger reactions for a valuable corrosion effect without reducing damage output of Laevaitain's own kit. The same can't quite be said about the other popular teams like Laevatain, where if you do consume Laevatain's heat infliction away, she quite literally will slow down and her damage output will tank a bit. However, I will add this, you can still use her with Laevatain and beat everything. It just takes longer, or you have to pay attention to when you do consume the fire inflictions, so that you won't find a case where you could have converted them to 4 melting flames, but instead you consumed all of them with the nature infliction. This can be avoided if you play it well, but to a certain extent, you will still consume some melting flames as long as you do use Gilberta on the team. The whole team simply isn't as synergistic as it could be, right? But can you just use her anyway though? Absolutely. The last thing to mention with Gilberta would be that it is also an unfortunate case that most bosses right now has like no multi-target scenarios except for one of them. So Gilberta's value with the gathering isn't as good as it could be. With all that said, we'll move on to future talk now. Gilberta's true value lies when more nature infliction related teams are released, be it just by stacking more nature infliction or triggering reactions with the nature infliction. Currently, the best team that can trigger reactions with the nature infliction would be the Yvonne Ice team, where Yvonne can just turn nature infliction into solidification, which is why Gilberta is great there. So for the future, Gilberta will only become stronger with more nature infliction related gimmicks being released. And you never know, the future fangyi might just be the type of character that utilizes Gilberta well. I could be wrong, but I don't know, I just feel like she has a whole tree vibe to her. She's kind of got that green feeling going on. Surely she's nature, right? Well, that I'm not sure, but what I am most certain about is if there are any other characters that are really similar to, say, Laevatain in the way they deal damage, where the entire kit converges down to one instant of hyper damage, Gilberta will actually be a really good option in that regard. So if any characters in the future are released that suits that kind of idea, Gilberta is going to be a really sought after option for that character. So with all that said, my personal recommendation with Gilberta is to actually wait for Umbral Monument that should be released soon, get an idea on how good your account is fighting against that mode, and then make an informed decision on whether Gilberta is a valuable pull for you. That should be the best general play, but if you're more of a risk taker, I actually recommend getting a copy of her because you'll be treated treating her as an investment. If a character is released that does really well with Gilberta, having their best support can mean a huge difference in your experience. But that is just an assumption. What could also happen is the character that suits Gilberta simply doesn't get released for a really long time. You simply never know, which is why I mentioned if you're a risk taker, you would go for her. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Feel free to discuss in the comment section, and I do hope you keep it civil. Next on the list will be discussions on Laevatain first. Now, she is no longer rated up, but you can still pull her with luck, or if you already pulled her, here's a review on her to see if you messed up or not. Long story short, absolutely not, and it's the best decision I think anyone can make. Now, we'll touch on the best team for her first, which one of her best teams would be Laevatain, Wolfguard, Akekure, and Ardelia. You can swap out Akekure for Antal. The first is better in AoE situations, the second's better in single target boss killing scenarios, but both of them are top tier. Now, to move on to her pros and cons, let's start with her pros. You see, with the beta's info on Umbra Monument, there will be multi-target scenarios within that mode, and Laevatain is the best multi-target damage dealer in the whole game. Not only that, she is still one of the best boss killers in the single target scenario anyway, with just her sheer damage output. Though she is held back with her slower melting flame gain against a singular enemy, but she's still really strong. So what you get is literally a jack of all trades and still a near master of all. She's good in all situations. And that's really all of her positives. It's direct and it's just straight up strong. As for her cons, well, there really isn't much, at least at the moment. She excels in most scenarios and is probably the most used team in the whole server, given her best allies are mostly accessible 5 stars and the free Ardelia that you could even get a potential 1 for to boost Laevatain even more. If I were to try and think of some cons, it would be that against speedy enemies that continuously moves, Laevatain might not connect a lot of her ult damage since the boss will be evading everywhere and you have to chase them down to land your ult, right? However though, this is just a skill based factor since you can time your moves based on the boss's pattern and avoid wasting your ult when they start evading. It's not really a big deal. The other con I can think of is just her being less ideal to use versus a single enemy, where the perfect scenario would see you land heat infliction on multiple enemies and convert all of them to melting flames. Again though, it's not even a big deal since she has proven more than enough to handle single bosses with an ult every 2 rotations. That's still going to be sufficient for you to clear a lot of things, well, anything really. Now then, if you consider the future, Laevatain is still a good valid pull, since the only way she wouldn't be is that if Laevatain becomes power crept in a short amount of time. That could technically happen and she might just be terrible next version, but there's no way to tell. It's not a great idea to base your decision on, which is why if you got yourself Laevatain, congratulations, I think it's the best choice out of the 3 with the least doubts involved. I think you made the right decision if you did went for her. Next on the list will be Yvonne, which will be rated up soon. To start with Yvonne's best team, there's actually 2. The first one would include herself, Zahi, Alesh, and Gilberta, while the second one's a lot more expensive where you swap off Alesh for Last Ride. Surprisingly, with a lot of community testing now, this premier team is actually very strong, but it does take some skill to use them well, and of course needing 2 full-fledged 6-star damage dealers to be well built. It's way too costly for the general public to go for, at least at the current moment, but you know, with time you won't be to have the whole team ready, obviously. The pros of Yvonne is simply that you get a strong damage dealer, and if we are to compare her with the other character in a similar role, which would be Laevatain, Laevatain's best scenario would be against multiple enemies, while Yvonne's best scenario is against singular enemies. She has a way longer range with her ult, which means she can also handle single bosses that move around better than Laevatain. She also has a much shorter ult damage output duration, which means she can nearly fully utilize Gilberta's high value debuff with a short period of time. Now as for her cons, Yvonne's ability in multi-target scenarios are actually not the best. However, that is mitigated with the help of Gilberta's Gathering, making sure Yvonne's kit can land on multiple enemies that's grouped together. But still, she doesn't compare to Laevatain's multi-target performance, right? She just slashes in such a big range that everyone gets burned and die. Now, we can make an argument for most bosses in later game are single target focused, so you don't really need that AoE capability as much, which is valid, but that may change with the new Umbra Monument mode. And in the end, you see, Laevatain is also one of the strongest options for boss killing anyway. So for all that reason, the recommendation I have if you played since release and already have a solid Laevatain team is for you to wait before pulling Yvonne, since we will likely get news on the next banners before the end of Yvonne's radar banner. Then you can make the best informed decision. Now, if you don't have Laevatain and you're wishing for a strong team, honestly, a very accessible endmin physical team will already work fine. As for future talks though, it's hard to put a pin down on Yvonne, because if new endgame modes get added and they are more skewed towards single bosses, Yvonne will be a strong option. However though, if new modes being mostly AoE scenarios with multi-targets, Yvonne might not have the best of time, especially if you don't have have Gilberta scatter along with her. But as usual, this is just talking about the future. We don't know exactly what's gonna happen. On top of all that though, a good point to be made would be that if better allies that can apply cryo and nature infliction get released, Yvonne's performance can actually be significantly stronger. However though, it's never the best idea to just assume that would happen. Hence my recommendation of waiting for news on the next banners first before making a decision. But do remember, if it's just like a character, absolutely go for it. And considering at least right now, the end games are not that hard where there are teams that straight up struggle to beat them, I'm personally more biased towards just playing for fun. That's just me though. So if you really like the Yvonne character, you get the Yvonne character. And now finally, we can talk about potential future characters, which are actually one of my main recommendations, which is just wait for them if you realistically can already beat everything. A very accessible physical team is actually already sufficient to deal with any endgame modes available right now, even including Umbra Monument, assuming they don't just overbuff it for no reason, right? You have a free Ardelia and a free 6-star selector to easily build any other team or just bolster up your physical team. So unless you really love the characters in the banners right now, you can definitely consider just straight up save things until you see the next obvious hyper value character. That character could be the very popular and lovable Fangyi, or a number of different badass villains and characters we saw in Wuling. There are a bunch of them that look like the next insane character, and in fact, some of them may be your absolute favorites over the options right now. I personally have a weak spot for Fangyi. I think she's going to make sure my wallet's empty when she's released. So yeah, if you're really all about min-maxing though, since you already have a physical team that's essentially free that you can absolutely beat everything with if you invest them enough, you can really just skip until you see the next crazy character and go say full potential on that character, right? That is one of the things you can consider. I think generally though, most people would have probably pulled for one Laevatain team, which would mean at the bare minimum, you have a Laevatain team and a physical team ready that should be able to beat everything if you put in investments in them. The best min-max way should be to just wait for the next big character release. But that's just speaking min-maxing. Pulling for who you want to play with is still the best move. Like myself, I've been building myself an Aviwena and having the best of fun I could have, and I've not regretted since then. And that'll be all from a breakdown on who you should be going for. A general way to think about this is wait for it, the best informed decision that you could make, but otherwise just pull and play who you love. That's the best way. Do drop me a follow for more Arknights content. I do cover a lot of them. And take care.